What's up, everyone? Welcome to Week 16 Stat Chasing. I hope you guys had an awesome Week 16. Some of our favorite players, like Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, Mike Evans, all had huge weeks. Alvin Kamara. So it's a good week for a number of my teams. I hope you guys also had a lot of success, won some championships. In this show, I will be going through the Week 16 stats that I think are really important for understanding what happened. At this point, we're looking primarily at next season and Week 17 DFS or playoff contests like the FFPC playoff contest, which Pete and I will be talking a bit about in upcoming episodes of Ship Chasing. So that's kind of what I'm focusing on as I look at these notes. As a reminder, I'll be looking at PFF stats, target per route run, yards per route run, Ben Gretch's twist on this weighted targets per route run, which adds in air yards. Also be looking at some RotoViz stats, air yards, target share, share of air yards, Josh Hermsmeyer's Whopper metric, which combines market share air yards and market share targets. Average depth of target is where I get that data from RotoViz, or ADOT. Expected points, which weights opportunities by the line of scrimmage, I get from RotoViz, especially useful for running backs, in my opinion. And then some shout outs to @ChangeCollege, who does timestamps for each team in the comments below. At Ball Street FF, Steven Krupka, who's been doing highlight videos for each week here, which has been awesome. And then Sam Hoppin, at Sam Hoppin, who does charts each week. And I'll pull those up now. These charts are really nice for the YouTube here. I noticed on my screen share that the dotted line is a little light here on the y-axis. It is rated 20%. So we're looking, there's nothing like all that special about this threshold, but generally it creates this area up at the top, this top right quadrant here, where we generally want to see our wide receiver ones. We want to see him getting targeted at a high level. So this is over 20% target per route run. We want to see him running a lot of routes. Right here at 80% is the threshold here, just kind of a nice visual aid. And then the bubble here represents the share of air yards. So we want guys also getting a lot of air yards to go with their high rate of targets and lots of routes. That's how you get a bunch of volume. That's generally where we want to see the wide receiver ones. And we almost always see DeAndre Hopkins here. We do again this week. We'll get to that. So let's start with the running backs here. Kenyon Drake, he ended up playing 63% of snaps. Chase Edmonds suffered a hip injury. He's day-to-day. It's possible we get Kenyon Drake in kind of a lead role without dealing with Chase Edmonds. Although DJ Foster also played 21% of snaps. So I would say, that's probably his floor, I would imagine, with Chase Edmonds out. So I don't think Kenyon Drake would be like in the David Johnson range where he's playing literally every snap. But 70 to 80% of snaps definitely seems very plausible for Kenyon Drake if we do not get Chase Edmonds this week. Keep your eye on that. Kenyon Drake, not efficient again. He's struggled with efficiency this season. He had 4 green zone carries in this game, only scored one of them. He had 18 rushing attempts for 45 yards. He did score that one touchdown, as I mentioned. Had 5 receiving yards on 3 targets. So, overall not very efficient. Definitely the Cardinals seem like a candidate to add a running back. Drake is not signed after the year. I don't think they'll probably hand the whole backfield over to Chase Edmonds and DJ Foster and, Eno Benjamin, who they didn't really use at all this season. So my guess is they bring someone in. It's possible, of course, they bring Drake back and just kind of run this back. But Drake, very, unsafe asset at the moment. DeAndre Hopkins, as I mentioned, right where we want to see our wide receiver ones. Really strong underlying volume. Not as strong as we've sometimes seen because he had a low ADOT even for him. He had a 6.2 ADOT. Generally, he's up at least like 7, 8, but that came with less air yards than is ideal. But, he was targeted at still a pretty high rate, a decent Whopper on the day. His Whopper was 0.52. So, not the biggest day for DeAndre Hopkins in terms of the underlying volume, but the bigger concern was just the yards per target here was at 4. So he only turned 12 targets into 8 for 48. But he did have 12 targets and 75 air yards. Could have been a bigger day if he had had a decent yards per target. Christian Kirk, he actually had the same Whopper as DeAndre Hopkins. He had a Whopper of 0.52 as well, but he ran a route on 91% of dropbacks compared to 95% for DeAndre Hopkins. So, on slightly less routes, 2 less routes, he had the same percentage of the offense. Yards per route run here of 1.43, which isn't great, but he did have a yards per target of 7.6, which was, decently better than DeAndre Hopkins. Overall, not a very good game really for either guy on a per route basis, but Kirk has struggled to even get the volume, and here he had 113 air yards and 10 targets. So he could be pretty interesting as long as we do have Kyler this week, who's banged up with a leg injury. The only other thing I'll note here is that Trent Sherfield ran around on 7% of dropbacks. That's only notable because we already have Keyshawn Johnson playing ahead of Andy Isabella. Now Trent Sherfield playing ahead of him. I think Andy Isabella is probably in the permanent doghouse here. I think we can chalk him up as a bust at this point. Dan Arnold ran around on 53% of dropbacks. That is up quite a bit from where he's been prior to week 15. He was at 49% in week 15, but he was at 33% in week 14. He was at 19% back in week 13. So we have had we've seen a steady increase here for Dan Arnold. Very kind of each week he's been improving, sometimes by a lot, sometimes like this week just by a few percentage points, but becoming a bigger and bigger part of the offense. Kyler has looked for him a decent amount when he's been out there. 5 targets in this game, 83 air yards, 8 out of 16.6, very high for a tight end. And he does always seem to get targeted, a couple times deep downfield. So, at this point, Dan Arnold still just kind of a dart throw, but if we do get Kyler, I think he's more solidly in that dart throw mix, kind of like maybe a slightly better version of Dawson Knox in terms of your dart throw level tight ends. Moving to Atlanta, we've got, we were supposed to have, or we were told that Ito Smith was basically going to be the lead back here going forward, but Todd Gurley actually led in snaps 40% to 32% for Ito Smith and 28% for Brian Hill. Brian Hill had the most expected points, 8.6 expected points. This is gross. There's not really much to talk about in the backfield. Todd Gurley also not due back next year. I would be really surprised if they do bring him back, given that he's basically benched, or at least verbally benched at the end of the season. Another team that I think is very likely to bring someone in. At wide receiver, we had Calvin Ridley run around on 87% of dropbacks. He had 27% of the targets, 59% of the air yards. You see here, this is the bubble that we want to see, this huge, massive bubble showing the air yards to go with the really high target rate. He had a Whopper of 0.82, which is an elite number. He had a yards per target of 14.4, which is also an elite mark for anyone, and yards per route run as a result of 3.82. He did not get in the end zone, which prevented this from being a huge fantasy day, but he did go 5 for 130 on 9 targets. He's locked in as just an elite wide receiver. Whether or not Julio Jones plays, and as we look to the future, whether or not Julio Jones falls off a bit, I think Calvin Ridley looking like a locked-in stud wide receiver, tied to Matt Ryan. That's some, really good outlook moving forward. Russell Gage ran around on 90% of dropbacks. He hasn't done a ton. He didn't do much of this week. Yards per out run of 0.66. Curious to see if his role is as locked in as it was this year. Yards per out run on the season of just 1.45, which isn't terrible, but it's not that great. So maybe they bring in someone else where they're experimenting with getting Laquan Treadwell on the field a bit more. But I think generally Russell Gage is probably pretty safe to continue this role into 2021. We'll see. At tight end, Hayden Hurst, he ran around on 82% of dropbacks, which is a really high rate. He was not targeted heavily, only 16% target per route run. 8 out of 7.4, pretty standard for a tight end. Yard per target of 9.4. So overall, okay yards per route run of 1.47. Did get in the end zone on 5 for 47 on 5 targets. But the biggest thing here is that 82% routes run per dropback. And back in week 15, he was only at 66%. He was at 64% week 14. So it's a pretty big improvement to see him up at 82%. I'm not like necessarily expecting that to happen again, but were it to, definitely raises his ceiling here in week 17. J.K. Dobbins, as we move to Baltimore, he's someone that's definitely exciting for 2021, and the people are going to be very excited about. But I think Gus Edwards will be back. I do not think Mark Ingram will be back. Releasing him saves $5 million. I would expect the Browns to use that option. But I think we'll still have Gus Edwards. Gus Edwards in this game played 50% of snaps to 51% for J.K. Dobbins. He had 14.2 expected points to 11.1 for J.K. Dobbins. Gus Edwards had 3 green zone carries to J.K. Dobbins 2. Although J.K. Dobbins also had a green zone target. So they were equal, and J.K. Dobbins ended up being the guy who got in the end zone. But, there's 6 green zone opportunities in this backfield. They're split evenly. That hurts because J.K. Dobbins is undoubtedly going to be the much more expensive running back here. I actually think Gus Edwards might be pretty interesting next season because he'll be much, much cheaper than J.K. Dobbins, I would imagine. And, he's a decent bet to actually lead the backfield in expected points because he gets worked around the goal line. And while J.K. Dobbins does have an advantage in routes, this week he ran a route on 49% of snaps to 29% for Gus Edwards. He's definitely the guy more involved as a pass catcher. There's just not that many targets to go around. And actually, Gus Edwards got 2 to J.K. Dobbins 1. So it's not even locked in that J.K. Dobbins will lead every week in targets, although he probably will lead overall throughout the course of the season next year in targets. But it's just not a spot where we're really chasing the targets. We'd rather chase the touchdowns. So I think I'll probably be lower than market on J.K. Dobbins, although he definitely looks like a really interesting player. Moving to wide receiver, Marquise Brown had a route run on 90% of dropbacks, 17% of targets, 11% of air yards, whopper of 0.33. Not that great in terms of the target volume. We see him here where we do not particularly want to see guys who are, banking on to be wide receiver ones. At this point, that ship has sailed. I think no one's really banking on Marquise Brown to be a wide receiver one, but he ran a lot of routes. 90% of routes did not get the volume. Weighted target per route run of just 1.1. That's on that same yards per route run scale. And yeah, he had 4 for 25 and a touchdown. But the big thing here was the air yards, only 20 air yards for Marquise Brown here. Pretty disappointing on the air yards in particular. Obviously, we'd like to see more than 4 targets as well. Miles Boykin has been impressing a little bit in terms of just kind of being on the field. He had looked like he was completely phased out of the offense. And really, it took until Dez Bryant had that false positive for COVID before Miles Boykin started to get any run again. It looked like he had been passed by Devin Duvernay and then passed by Dez Bryant. But here he ran a route on 59% of dropbacks, not like locked in as a full-time player, but that was the second highest among wide receivers behind Marquise Brown. I wouldn't rule him out from having a role next season when it looked pretty dark for him to have a role at one point. This year, Devin Duvernay actually was third. He had ran around 48% of dropbacks. None of these guys really did anything, by the way. Devin Duvernay had a yards per target of 0. He had 1 reception for 0 yards on 1 target. So, Devin Duvernay didn't do anything. Miles Boykin had 1 reception for 13 yards on 2 targets. Didn't do anything. But, just trying to see who's going to be in the rotation going forward. Looks like Willie Snead, and I did not see an injury, but his snaps fell off a lot. He only ran a route. He only ran 7 routes in the game. That was on 24% of dropbacks. While Lamar Jackson did look for him a lot, he had a target on 29% of his routes. He is seeing way less playing time. So it would be interesting if Willie Snead maybe doesn't come back or, is getting phased out a bit. Keep your eye on that. If this offense ends up taking a little bit of a step forward next year, some of these wide receivers could end up mattering. Mark Andrews, he's the guy as we look forward, to week 17, look forward to the playoffs if the Ravens make the playoffs. He's the guy that is by far the most interesting. He ran a route here on 83% of dropbacks. He was targeted on 46% of his routes. He ran 24 routes. He had 11 targets. Really, really impressive to earn that many targets. He had 46% of the targets, 62% of the air yards. He had a whopper of 1.12. This is a scale that's supposed to go to 1 and is the type of thing we usually see wide receivers, topping out well before 1. To see a tight end at 1.12 in whopper is just really, really impressive. Weighted target per route run of 3.96. He had a yards per target of 6.9, however, so he left a lot of this on the field. He dropped, I believe, 2 touchdowns. So obviously that was really frustrating. He still had a yards per route run of 3.17. He had 76 yards on his 11 targets and 6 receptions. So could have been a much bigger day. Mark Andrews, though, is the focal point of a passing offense at the tight end position. That is rare and very valuable for fantasy purposes. So looking forward to 2021. I'm excited to draft Mark Andrews again, even though I took him really high this past year. It didn't really pay off in a huge way. It wasn't a disaster, but I'm gonna run it. I'm gonna run it back with Mark Andrews. I think he, Kittle, Kelsey, Darren Waller, will be the unanimous top 4 tight ends, and that'll be for a reason. Those guys have a profile that the other guys at the position really don't have. Moving to Buffalo, we had Zach Moss slightly leading in snaps, 50% of snaps to Devin Singletary's 49%. Pretty typical to see this backfield split down the middle. It usually is. Expected points actually lean Singletary's way. That's also not uncommon either. You see the snaps slightly towards one guy, but the expected points tilted toward the other guy sometimes. So in this game, Devin Singletary got 1 green zone carry, and Zach Moss did as well. Zach Moss, though, is the one who got in the end zone. And then Devin Singletary led in targets 2-1. So we're going to need one of these guys to take over this backfield this offseason for them to really matter. I think, for the rest of this year, we're not interested in this backfield really. I think Zach Moss has at least a chance to take a bigger slice of this backfield, entering his second year. He made a big, he really took away quite a bit of the incumbent starter's workload as the season went on. So I think there's a chance they hand Moss at least kind of a 60-40, 65-35 type backfield next year. We'll have to see where the prices come in terms of their redraft ADP. Moving to wide receiver here, Stefon Diggs, man. Stefon Diggs won me multiple dynasty championships this past week. Come from behind victories. Really exciting. Stefon Diggs just crushing it with the 3 touchdowns. I feel kind of like the touchdowns were earned a little bit, for us Diggs owners, because he only had 5 touchdowns prior to this, and he was getting sniped on touchdowns by the tight ends, by Isaiah McKenzie, Gabriel Davis. They're going to basically everybody but him, and he was getting these massive whoppers and doing pretty well in terms of yards per target, doing awesome in terms of yards per route run, but not delivering touchdowns to go with it. And here we had him getting a yards per route run of 3.92. That's weighted targets per run of 2.57, yards per target of 13.2. Both of those are great. Puts it together for this yards per route run, this elite yards per route run. And at 11 targets for 9 receptions, 145 yards, and the 3 touchdowns, which obviously delivered the massive fantasy day. He ran around on 90% of dropbacks. He was targeted on 30% of his routes, so huge targets per route run there. 8 out of 10.3. He had a whopper of 0.65, 30% of the targets, 29% of the air yards. All very impressive. Didn't have like a huge share of the air yards, I suppose, if we're picking nits. That would be because Gabriel Davis, he actually led in air yards with 32%. And Davis actually ran the most routes, which in this case maybe isn't necessarily positive since it was such a blowout. The fact that Diggs didn't finish the game, indicative of his status on the team. But Davis was only targeted on 13% of his routes. That kind of comes with his role. He had an 8 out of 25 compared to Diggs at 10.3. Those deeper threats are going to get targeted less often, but have more air yards. And that's exactly what we saw with Gabriel Davis here on this part of the chart that we don't necessarily want to see, guys, but at least it came with a bunch of air yards. So Davis had an underwhelming yards per target of 6.6, 5 targets for 3 receptions and 33 yards. I still remain pretty bullish on Davis overall, looking forward to next year. I mean, on the season, he has a yards per target of 8.5. He has a weighted target per route run of 1.28. So not the hugest role, but he's been really good when targeted. And they have a decision to make with John Brown here in terms of if they bring him back. They may not. And if they do not bring John Brown back, if they cut John Brown to get a little bit of savings, Gabriel Davis is looking like he's going to be in an awesome role next year. Who's kind of the deep threat to Stephon Diggs and Cole Beasley operating underneath. There should be some big spike weeks for Gabriel Davis. Cole Beasley, meanwhile, had a route run on 71% of dropbacks. He had 14% of the targets, 9% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.27. Yards per target of only 4.3, and so pretty underwhelming yards per route run. I was actually sweating him in one of those dynasty leagues. Actually, a dynasty league where I had Devontae Adams for a come from behind win, and then I had to sweat Cole Beasley. So I was happy to see this poor day. But overall, Beasley has had an awesome season. Cole Beasley has a yards per route run of 2.1. He does not lead the team because Diggs is at 2.5 because Diggs is just having this incredible season. But Cole Beasley can play. I really think that we should consider him to be probably more talented than we were giving him credit before the season. Has a yards per target on the season of 9.6. He's been targeted on 22% of his routes. And we see that in certain games, Allen just peppers him with targets. He gets open consistently. So more of a fantasy asset than I think he's been given credit for. And just running a lot more routes than you would expect from your typical slot receiver. Here he was at 71%, but sometimes he's at even higher. He's at 74% in week 15. He was at 87% in week 14. So, Cole Beasley, I think, will continue to run a lot of routes next year. This is a team that passes out of 3 wide receiver sets a lot, 3+ wide receiver sets. They're out of 4 wide receiver sets a fair amount too. So he's at 75% routes run per dropback on the season. It's a pretty high mark for a slot wide receiver. Don't be sleeping on Cole Beasley as we look at week 17 and into the playoffs and into next year. At tight end, Dawson Knox, he ran around 56% of dropbacks here. Still remains kind of a touchdown or bust type of dude. He did get 351 on 4 targets with a nice yards per target of 12.8, but 56% of dropbacks is not enough routes to really trust a guy. So continues to just be kind of that dart throw level play. You're really banking on a touchdown. At Carolina, we have Mike Davis getting 60% of the snaps. He had 13 expected points. He left 4.2 points on the field. He got 3 green zone carries. He only converted 1 of them. So he had 14 rushing attempts for 28 yards and 1 touchdown. He did not get targeted in this game. He did run a route on 50% of the Panthers dropbacks, but was not targeted. It's continued to be like less and less a part of the offense here. We're not probably going to get Christian McCaffrey in week 17. I would not be interested in playing Mike Davis really in week 17. Trenton Cannon got 31%. Trenton Cannon got 4% of the snaps, and Rodney Smith got 31%. He siphoned away 6.5 expected points. He also got 1 green zone carry, and he ran a route on 62% of his snaps. So he was kind of the more pass-catching running back. And that was something that happened last week as well, that Rodney Smith ran a route on a higher percentage of his snaps than Mike Davis did, which basically means Rodney Smith, if anything, is kind of the more pass-catching back of these two. And so another reason why I'm just not that interested in Mike Davis as a Week 17 start. And obviously, hopefully back to a fully healthy Christian McCaffrey in 2021. At wide receiver, DJ Moore ran around on 100% of dropbacks. He had 36% of the targets, 45% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.85, was a wide receiver one, kind of an elite wide receiver one, underlying volume day for DJ Moore, weighted target per route run of 2.55. Everything's awesome until you get to the yards per target, which was 4.1. He had 10 targets for 5 receptions, 37 air yards. So the yards per target ruined what could have been a huge day, could have really, had kind of an alpha wide receiver day in terms of production, but the yards per target killed it. He has a 10.6 yards per target this season. That's awesome. And so we should not really worry about that, but that's why DJ Moore flopped. And from what I heard, I think a lot of that comes down to Teddy Bridgewater. Robbie Anderson, he had a route run on 91% of dropbacks. He had 36% of the targets, 22% of the air yards. That 36% of the targets ties DJ Moore. 22% of the air yards, though, because his ADOT was 5.9 and DJ Moore's 12.4. Still a very nice whopper of 0.69, but we get to the yards per target and things fall apart again. He was at 4.3. He had 10 targets as well, 7 receptions, 39 yards, and a touchdown. So another disappointing day given the underlying volume. Curtis Samuel ran around on 74% of dropbacks. He had 18% of the targets, 27% of the air yards, a solid but not great whopper of 0.46. But he had a yards per target of 21.2, and so he blew up with 5 for 106 on 5 targets. Very efficient day for Curtis Samuel, but it's kind of weird. Like the two guys who should have had the blow-up days did not. Curtis Samuel, although he did not get in the end zone, at least got over 100 yards on kind of middling volume. Ian Thomas ran around on 79% of dropbacks here, but he did not get a target. Continues to get grosser and grosser for Ian Thomas. At this point, I would say I'm like hoping that they just bring Ian Thomas back and we know to ignore this position. I don't trust this system to necessarily be like incorporating a tight end. Like at this level of, lack of targets for the tight end, with Ian Thomas has been targeted a little bit previously. I have to think some of it comes down to the system. But yeah, I probably fading whoever Carolina's tight end is. Obviously, Ian Thomas will probably go like undrafted in some leagues, which he should. Moving to Chicago, David Montgomery continues his late season kind of league winning. I shouldn't even say kind of. I mean, he was a league winner this year. Didn't expect it, but he was. 83% of the snaps here. He had 16.4 expected points, 3.7 points over expectation. So he was efficient again. He had 3 green zone carries. He did score 1 touchdown on those. 23 attempts for 95 yards and a touchdown. The big thing here is that Cordarrelle Patterson, he played, but he only had 15% of the snaps. Did he play? Let me just check that. Yeah, I think I'll check on Cordarrelle Patterson here because I wasn't sure. I think I may have attributed to his snaps someone else. Ryan Nall also got 5 snaps for 7%. But yeah, as we look at David Montgomery, so much of what he did this season, was a result of having the backfield completely to himself. And so I do wonder if with Tariq Cohen back, and he was re-signed, so he'll definitely be back, if he ends up creating kind of a situation where David Montgomery just doesn't have all the touches. But, David Montgomery, we put too much emphasis on his efficiency at points this season, and we put too much emphasis or not enough emphasis on just the fact that he had the workload to himself. Yeah, so the snaps I wrote down wrong. David Montgomery had 83%. Cordarrelle Patterson did not play, which was the key here because the fact that he missed allowed David Montgomery to have that elite share of the backfield. Ryan Nall had 15% of the snaps, and then Nartavis Pierce had 7%. And so that's kind of what we expected, that if Cordell Patterson didn't play, that David Montgomery was just going to get that elite share of the snaps. He did. And yeah, so I think that's key in understanding why David Montgomery continues to have these big fantasy days. If Cordell Patterson had played, that 16.4 expected points could have easily been down closer to 10. And then you don't have the nice week 16 performance for David Montgomery. Moving to wide receiver, Allen Robinson had a route run on 82% of dropbacks. He had 36% of the targets, 27% of the air yards, a really nice whopper of 0.73. He went 10 for 103 on the day on 13 targets. He did not get in the end zone, but otherwise very strong day. Yards per route run of 3.22. You see him on the chart here. Did not run a full slate of routes, but otherwise tremendous from Allen Robinson. Really hoping he gets an improved quarterback situation in 2021. Darnell Mooney ran a route on 85% of dropbacks, which actually led the team. He had 19% of the targets, 13% of the air yards, whopper of 0.38. He wasn't used super downfield or anything. He had just an 8 out of 5.3. Not particularly efficient, but continue to be fairly impressed with just this team wanting Darnell Mooney to be a big part of their offensive plan. He had 7 targets, went 4 for 39. Anthony Miller had a route run of 54% of dropbacks. Javon Wims was at 41%. Miller really seems to have dropped off here in terms of his routes run. He's someone that I think we're going to slowly start to forget about. At tight end, Cole Kmet ran around 72% of dropbacks, 44% for Jimmy Graham. So Kmet continues to have this lead here. Kmet had 17% of the targets, 27% of the air yards, pretty solid whopper of 0.44, but things fell apart for him with the yards per target of just 3. He only delivered 2 for 18 on 6 targets. Jimmy Graham, meanwhile, delivered 7 for 66 on 8 targets with pretty solid yards per route run of 4.06. Pretty solid, undersells that. He had 4 for 69 on 5 targets and 2 touchdowns. And Jimmy Graham had a yards per route run of 4.06. So, what to make of this? Well, as we look forward to 2021, Cole Kmet, he only has a yards per route run of 0.9 this year. He has done a better job of getting on the field. I think he is the Bears tight end of the future, but second-year tight ends are actually not great bets for breakouts, particularly not when they've had trouble earning targets and had trouble doing anything with those targets. Tight ends typically take a little while to develop. I think 2021 will be a development year for Cole Kmet. He's not someone that I really plan to draft much of. Moving to Cincinnati, Gio Bernard had 58% of the snaps. He had a really nice workload of 19 expected points. He was efficient on that, with adding a point in efficiency. And that did not come with any green zone targets. It's primarily driven by receiving work. He had 8 targets. He went 7 for 66 on those 8 targets. He had 16 carries for 65 yards. So pretty solid day for Giovanni Bernard. And that's on top of Samaje Perine, who scored 15.8 points over expected on a workload of 13.8 fantasy points. That's just on 38% of the snaps. He had 2 green zone carries. He scored 1 of those. He added a touchdown from outside the green zone as well. He went 13 for 95 and 2 on the ground, 4 targets for 4 for 41 through the air. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, the Bengals were just doing awesome on the ground this week. I guess we shouldn't have been shocked. This Houston defense has been a target for every ground game all season, but to see the Bengals get rolling like this, I mean, wow, that was impressive. Split 2 ways, but both guys really delivered. So this Houston, I don't have up who Houston plays next week. Let me see if I can pull that up at some point. But That's definitely a spot we want to be targeting. At wide receiver, T. Higgins ran a route on 90% of dropbacks. He had 24% of the targets, 41% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.64. He had pretty nice yards per target of 11, yards per route run of 2.83, 6 for 99 and a touchdown on 9 targets. T. Higgins continues to have an awesome year. That's a really nice game to have without Joe Burrow playing. He has the yards per target of 8.6 this year. He's been targeted on 21% of his routes. Weighted target per route run of 1.93. That's pretty nice. Yards per route run of 1.83. That's right around where DK Metcalf was last year, to give you an indication. I think the ceiling is really high for T. Higgins, especially with Burrow back. I think AJ Green's probably gone. I think with that 8.6 yards per target, that's a lot higher. Like, you look around at his competition and you're looking at guys who, are not putting up those types of numbers. AJ Green was at 5.4 this year. We had other guys were lower. Sorry, my spreadsheet's glitching on me here. Tyler Boyd was the guy I was trying to pull up. He was at 8. So he also had pretty close to T. Higgins, but still, T. Higgins is a rookie. So I think this team's going to build their passing game a lot more around T. Higgins next year. He is one of the prime candidates for a second-year breakout, like a massive, wide receiver one type of breakout. So I expect to be targeting a lot of T. Higgins. Drew Sample here, his routes were just kind of way down from anything that would be interesting. He ran a route on 44% of dropbacks. So who cares? Moving to Cleveland. We have Kareem Hunt had 43% of the snaps here. Nick Chubb led the way with 58% of snaps. Nick Chubb had 15.9 expected points. He was efficient with 1.7 points over expectation. He scored his 1 green zone carry. He also got 5 targets. Pretty nice for Nick Chubb. Went 5 for 38. Now, of course, they're going to be throwing to the running backs more here because they did not have any wide receivers in this game. They had that whole COVID situation where basically their entire wide receiver crew was out. So I think that 5 targets probably a blip, probably nothing to take too seriously moving into next week and into next season. Kareem Hunt had 43% of the snaps I mentioned, 11.4 expected points. He scored on his lone green zone carry as well. He also had 5 targets. They needed to throw to somebody. At wide receiver, nothing really to talk about. The guy ended up being this dude, Jamarcus Bradley, who had 11 targets. He was targeted on, he had a whopper of 0.53, targeted on 22% of his routes. Marvin Hall came in as a field stretcher. He only had 2 targets on 56 routes. Really didn't do anything except just kind of be out there. What was interesting was at tight end, where we had Austin Hooper running around on 75% of dropbacks and a target per route run of 33%. He had a target share of 30%, air yard share of 28%, a whopper of 0.65. So Hooper really stepped up and essentially operated as the wide receiver 1 this week. He had 15 targets, 7 for 71. He had a yards per target of 5.1, which isn't great. Yards per route run of 1.65, which is decent. But, I think, a lot to ask maybe for him to basically be a wide receiver 1 in this game. Didn't completely fall on his face. Harrison Bryant ran a route on 89% of dropbacks, which was very high. That's an elite mark for a tight end. And he essentially was operating as the big slot wide receiver. He played 51 snaps in the slot this week. Previous high was 17. So, again, all this stuff is kind of fluky with the Browns. We've had a lot of kind of fluky, weird stuff this season with the Browns passing game, but is a interesting sign for Harrison Bryant terms of what his role can be at the NFL, that they were able to put him in that role. Still, he has not been very good this year in terms of yards per route run. Basically right where Cole Kmet is. He does not really profile as a 2021 breakout, but down the line, I think Harrison Bryant looks pretty interesting. Got involved right away as a rookie, and he won the motherfucking Mackey Award. Moving to Dallas, we've got an even split here for Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard. 53% for Elliott and 47% for Tony Pollard. I think Pollard's going to be a pretty popular, like, zero running back type dude next season, and probably for good reason, because he's finally actually worked himself into a committee here with Zeke. I think we're probably going to see this going forward. Maybe not exactly 53-47. Maybe it's more like 60-40, but Zeke's days of 80+% snaps are long, long gone. He did have 18 expected points in this game, Zeke did, and he had 3 green zone carries, and he went 105 on the ground on 19 carries. And he also had 4 for 34 on 4 targets through the air. So, the Zeke truthers are going to feel somewhat vindicated here as people pour dirt on his grave. But I think the important thing is that Zeke's probably going to be somewhat expensive again next year, and Pollard will probably be cheaper. So, the cheaper guy here is probably the guy to own, even if we can see days out of Zeke still with pretty solid workload. So Zeke's not dead, but he's probably going to go in a range where there's going to be a lot of wide receivers that I like. I expect to own almost none of him next year. At wide receiver, Amari Cooper ran around 82% of dropbacks. He had 20% of the targets, 24% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.47. He had a yards per target of 20.2, absolutely crushed in that regard. And so he had a yards per route run of 4.32. He had 4 receptions on 6 targets, but turned that into 121 yards. That actually tied him with Michael Gallup, who also had 121 yards. Gallup also got in the end zone twice, though, and Gallup was the dude who had the underlying volume to back it up. He ran more routes, ran around on 94% of dropbacks. He had 27% of the targets and 38% of the air yards. He had a whopper of 0.66, which is kind of like a wide receiver 1 level whopper. Pretty nice to Amari Cooper's 0.47. He had a weighted target per route run of 2.23, which was pretty decently above Cooper at 1.81. And he was very efficient as well with the yards per target of 15.1, yards per route run of 3.78. Really strong game for Michael Gallup. It had been quiet for Michael Gallup. He looked like, remember early on with Dak, he was kind of locked into this deep threat role. That didn't really suit him. It's been nice that he's been able to move back into like an intermediate kind of wide receiver 1 type of range. This week he was at 11.2 ADOT. That's kind of more where he belongs, I think. I don't think he's like this deep threat field stretcher. He was being kind of wasted, kind of sacrificed to the offense a little bit. He's had a really nice close to the season. CeeDee Lamb, I wish, was just out there more. I think they could run, a lot more out of 3 wide receiver sets. He only ran around on 71% of dropbacks. Love to see him up above 80%. That'd be great. Ideally up above 90%, but don't think we'll get that. He had 17% of the targets, 23% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.41. He had 5 targets, went 3 for 65 and a touchdown. Yards per route run of 2.71. And he's been really, really good this year. He had a yards per target on the season so far of 8.7. He's been targeted on 22% of his routes. Yards per route run of 1.9. He does look like with a healthy Dak that he could explode in his second year. Now, if they keep him as the slot guy, as the third guy between him, Cooper, Gallup, and he's just not going to be out there for 90% of routes, that's going to hurt. But hey, he's got an off season to make an impression and basically prove to them that they should be getting him on the field more. And he has done a lot to prove to them already that yards per target, I think can potentially drive additional playing time for him next year. Although in Cooper and Gallup's defense, Cooper has a 9 yards per target and Gallup has an 8.7 as well. So I think they just have 3 really strong receivers. Hopefully they get CeeDee Lamb on the field more at the expense of these guys like Noah Brown and Cedric Wilson, because I don't think those routes really need to be there. At tight end, Dalton Schultz continues to run an elite route share, 88% of routes. We'll have to see what happens next year with Blake Jarwin coming back, but I think Schultz did really well with his opportunity. Didn't get targeted much in this one. He only had 4 targets on his 30 routes, 10% target per route run, but he he still continues to run a full slate of routes. Impressive in that regard. Moving to Denver, we had Phillip Lindsay miss this game, and so we got Melvin Gordon. And what we thought would be a workhorse role wasn't exactly. 66% of snaps, only 8 expected points. We had Royce Freeman at 23% of snaps and Levante Bellamy at 10% of snaps. They siphoned away a total of 6.2 expected points. So it just didn't end up being all that, like the total value of the backfield just wasn't there. Melvin Gordon did get 16 attempts, took that for 79 yards, and he was not targeted, which is really going to hurt the expected points of any running back. So moving to wide receiver, we had Jerry Jeudy get elite volume. He ran around on 84% of dropbacks, 35% of targets, 34% of air yards, a whopper of 0.76. That's a wide receiver one, true wide receiver one whopper. Weighted target per route run of 3.19, which is fantastic, but it fell apart when it came to the yards per target. He struggled with drops. He had a 4.1 yards per target this week, 1.42 yards per route run. Not great. 15 targets, went for just 6 for 61. He had 180 air yards. I think we will see, Cortland Sutton probably back to his alpha wide receiver one role. Jerry Jeudy's ADOT may come down a little bit next year, but the fact that they were willing to use him as a deep threat this season, I think is still impressive. I'm not too worried about the drops. I'd obviously love to see an improved quarterback situation for Jerry Jeudy, but if people are starting to feel like he, isn't what they thought he was, I'm gonna go against that. I think Jerry Jeudy has had a ton of volume this year. I do not think they're just going to give up on their first round pick after a rookie season where, he did struggle a little bit in terms of yards per target at 7, but not abysmal. Yards per route run on the season so far of 1.51. So I think better days ahead for Jerry Jeudy. We had KJ Hamler here, got a concussion, so he only ran around on 8% of dropbacks. That's a bummer. He also looks like he could be impact player down the line, although yards per route run on the season of just 1.17. His breakout may be a bit delayed since I think he'll be behind Jeudy and Cortland Sutton, and he was behind Tim Patrick. So probably a little bit delayed for him. Tim Patrick, by the way, he ran around 96% of dropbacks, but targeted on just 8% of his routes. Not really that interested in him. Noah Fant ran a route on 84% of dropbacks. He was targeted on 21% of his routes. He had a whopper of 0.42, 21% of targets, 15% of air yards. Pretty nice from Noah Fant. If they get a better quarterback situation, I'd be very excited about Noah Fant in 2021. But as is, still pretty excited about him. I think he showed pretty well this season. Moving to the Lions, we have talks here, as we look to 2021 of them maybe trading Matthew Stafford. I think that would be really bad for everyone we care about at the skill position players, including DeAndre Swift. He had 68% of the snaps here. Adrian Peterson down to 11%, Kerrane Johnson at 21%. Pretty easy to imagine that he's up into like the 70+% range next season. Because DeAndre Swift comes with a profile of generally getting the green zone work and getting targets, he had 5 targets for 4 receptions and 25 yards in this game. He could be a really, really big impact fantasy player next year, but we need the quarterback play to come along with it. I'm really excited about DeAndre Swift. I think he has an awesome profile for fantasy football. Marvin Jones here ran a route on 100% of dropbacks. He had 10% of the targets, 8% of the air yards, a whopper of just 0.2. Did not get the volume in this game despite being out there 100% of the time. You see him here. This is exactly what we do not want wide receivers to look like. This is a flop. This is a flop week. Yeah, he was out there the entire time, but only targeted on 8% of his routes. Only got 3 targets on 36 routes. I mean, this is just really disappointing stuff. He had a 6.3 yards per target, but getting the targets in the first place is a skill. And, can't say I'm shocked that Marvin Jones let us down in a big spot when he was going to be really chalky on that 3-game slate. And, totally disappointed. Mohamed Sanu here ran around 78% of dropbacks. He has slowly worked himself into basically a full-time role. Obviously, this is with Kenny Golladay not playing, but curious to see if he's brought back. Danny Amendola ran around 61% of dropbacks, targeted pretty heavily here. 23% of the targets, 31% of the air yards, weighted target per out run of 2.48. Really nice mark there. 5.3 yards per target, obviously not very good. Went 7 targets for 5 receptions, 37 yards. Quintus Cephas ran around 39% of dropbacks. I think he, particularly if Sanu does not come back, he might have a bigger role in the offense, but it feels a little bit like they tried him out and it didn't go well. Like if Mohamed Sanu, who remember they picked up, was not, if he's passing you, then your chance at a full-time NFL role may be gone. TJ Hawkinson ran around 86% of dropbacks. That's great to see. Target per route run of 19%. He had 20% of the air yards, 20% of the targets, 19% of the air yards. Whopper of 0.43. Very inefficient on the day at 3.8 yards per target. However, took 6 targets and went 4 for 23. That is going to be the thing with TJ Hawkinson that we got to figure out. His yards per target this year was 7.5. Would like to generally see that higher. We want to see, young tight ends really showing a lot of promise as a wide receiver. But, and with the idea that the offense is then going to focus their passing attack more around the tight end than is typical. I still think that's a decent possibility because we will get a new head coach. I imagine that Bevel will be gone too. So there's a chance that whoever is coming in is excited, particularly about TJ Hawkinson, especially since Kenny Golladay might be gone. So TJ Hawkinson has a chance to be the focal point of his passing attack, and target per out run of 21% this year, yards per target of 7.5. If the coaching staff is on board with making him the focal point, I think he can deliver pretty nice fantasy value. So curious to see where his redraft ADP falls. Moving to Green Bay, we had kind of a breakout game here for A.J. Dillon. He had 58% of the snaps, 13.9 expected points. He added 12 points in efficiency. He got 2 green zone carries. He scored 1 of them. He also scored another touchdown from outside the green zone, went 21 for 124 yards and 2 touchdowns. Partly this was due to the Packers are just beating up the Titans. They were using Dillon to salt the game away, but we've got Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams as free agents after the offseason. A.J. Dillon, a second-round pick. This could potentially be a situation where Dillon is an absolute smash for dynasty owners. If he gets this backfield to himself, could see a huge spike in his value, redraft selection potentially in like the 3rd round, right? Because think about it. If Aaron Jones, Jamal Williams are both gone, are you seriously going to pass on this dude in the late 3rd? I think at a minimum he'll be going in the 4th round. So it'll be pretty exciting to see what happens here. Obviously, they could bring back at least one of these guys, which would dampen the enthusiasm a little bit. But, A.J. Dillon showing well in his opportunity this week. Aaron Jones, by the way, had 38% of the snaps, 10.5 expected points, played efficiently, added 2.3 points, but just didn't get enough of a workload to really do much. Davante Adams, of course, is the story of this game. You see him here, a comical placement on the chart here. I mean, this just is it's almost like I asked Sam to come up with an example, a hypothetical example of what a perfect wide receiver week would look like, right? I mean, he's here exactly where we want, 96% route run per dropback. He was targeted on 44% of his routes. He had an air yard share of 59%, target share of 50%. Half of the targets went to Davante Adams. He had an 11.8 yards per target. So literally half the time the ball is going to this dude, and he's still delivering basically elite efficiency on a per target basis. So just absurd. Just absurd. 12 targets for 11 receptions, 142 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Is having just an absolute historically great season. Right now, he's a yards per route run of 3.01. Just crushing this year. Winning people titles, just delivering fantasy goodness. So it's been a great year, Davante Adams. Tip of the hat to him. Hopefully, he continues it into 2021 because this has been a fun ride with Davante Adams. Marcus Valdes-Scantling, Alan Lazard were down below 65% route run per dropback, and we had Equanimous St. Brown, Tavon Austin, both at 25%. We had Robert Tonyan a dip in his routes. He was at 61%. So it seemed like behind Davante Adams, they're kind of just mixing things up a bit, trying to throw stuff against the wall, see what sticks a little bit. We had this guy, Dominique Daphne, get 18% of the routes. Now, I guess, part of this is the blowout. So, we're seeing maybe some other guys get mixed in, although Davante Adams was in at 96% routes run per dropback. So unclear, but that would be just a reason to be skeptical of anyone but Davante Adams right now in this offense, even including really Aaron Jones, because, if A.J. Dillon's going to get some work to salt away games, it's just kind of tough to trust anybody. I'd still trust Aaron Jones, but he's definitely not got the floor that we want. In Houston, David Johnson, he got all the snaps here, 96% of them, got 14.6 expected points, played very efficiently, added 14.3 points in efficiency, got 2 green zone carries, scored one of them, got a green zone target, scored that too, had 12 for 128 and a touchdown on the ground, had 3 for 3 and 11 reception yards and a touchdown through the air. Really nice stuff from David Johnson, someone that I thought was really not going to be that interesting this year, but had an awesome week 16. Kudos to him. Brandon Cooks had a route run on 95% of dropbacks. He had 30% of the targets, 51% of the air yards, an elite whopper of 0.81. He had a yards per target of 14.1, yards per route run of 4.03, 7 for 134 yards and a touchdown on 10 targets. Awesome game for Brandon Cooks. One thing Brandon Cooks taught me was just kind of to keep going back to him this year. So, that philosophy paid off. He disappointed last week, had an amazing week this week. Chad Hansen, he's starting to look to me a little bit just like a field stretcher. Had a route run on 95% of dropbacks, but targeted just 3 times on 35 routes, 6% target per route run. 8 out of 15.7. It's going to be inconsistent for this type of player, but does make me think they should prioritize bringing back Will Fuller because Hansen is playing the Will Fuller role. He's just not as good at it as Will Fuller, obviously. Kiki QT ran around 65% of dropbacks. He was targeted pretty highly, 25% target per route run. That's on an ADOT of 7.2, doing kind of more of that underneath stuff, that Randall Cobb type stuff. He had a whopper of 0.3, so not a huge volume. You see him here on the chart. Not exactly a huge day, but on a per route basis, pretty nice. He had a yards per route run of 2.25 with decent per target efficiency. Interesting to see what they do. I imagine they could just keep him kind of in this slot receiver role, and he's somewhat interesting there. At tight end, just a big jumbled mess here. Jordan Akins, 43% route run. Pharaoh Brown, 41%. Darren Fells, 27%. Cahill Waring, 22%. Can't really trust any of these guys. They're all kind of below dart throws for me, even though Jordan Akins was targeted on 25% of his routes. Yards per route run of 2.44 and went 4 for 39. I guess he's in the dart throw discussion, but God, yeah, just not that into it. So for week 17, assuming we get normal stuff from Houston, still not that interested. Moving to Indianapolis, got Jonathan Taylor here. He had 58% of the snaps, 15.9 expected points, 3.5 points over expectation. He got 2 green zone carries. He got 4 green zone carries, and he scored 2 of them. He had 2 touchdowns overall and 18 for 74 on the ground. But disappointing that more of the receiving work did not go to him. Nyheim Hines gobbled up a lot of it. He had 5 targets to Jonathan Taylor's 1. And Nyheim Hines had 42% of the snaps and 12.1 expected points. The nice thing here, especially as we look forward, is that Jordan Wilkins did not get a snap. That's something we've seen recently. He's been completely phased out. That continued. I think as we look forward, Jonathan Taylor is kind of set up as a version of Nick Chubb in 2021. I think he'll probably have pretty similar ADP. I don't know if I'll be that interested in him, at what I assume will probably be like a second-round cost, maybe even early second round. But I do think as a dynasty asset, I prefer him to Nick Chubb because he's younger, but 2, Nyheim Hines is going to become a free agent before Kareem Hunt. So we could see Jonathan Taylor in 2022 turn into just an absolute monster, or maybe in terms of like a David Montgomery type of situation, we could see him, if something were to happen to Hines, turn into a workhorse and get like 80% of the snaps. I'm a little bit worried about Indianapolis. They do not seem to want to give any running back a ton of snaps, but I still think there are routes to him getting that. And if he does, he could smash. Again, this is as we move forward to next season, really. At wide receiver, Zach Pascal ran a route on 95% of dropbacks. He had a whopper of 0.39, so not a ton of volume. 17% of the targets, 19% of the air yards. T.Y. Hilton had a route run on 80% of dropbacks. He had 20% of the targets, 35% of the air yards. Decent whopper of 0.55. You see him here, he's kind of right on the borderline of where we want guys. He had a yards per route run of 1.88. Decently, solid stuff, I guess. Michael Pittman ran around 70% of dropbacks. He had 14% of the targets, 24% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.38. He, continues to kind of do his Michael Pittman thing. Not all that bullish on him moving forward. But in his defense, Michael Pittman has a yards per target on the season of 8.6. He's not been targeted that heavily. And as a result, his yards per route run is 1.39, which is underwhelming. And I don't think we'll get a huge improvement in quarterback play. The quarterback play maybe get worse. So that would be the concern with Michael Pittman. But did work into a decent role in the offense. Not a prospect that I was all that excited about, but still has some upside. At tight end, the dude that jumps out to me here is Mo Alley-Cox. Not this week. He had a route run on just 18% of dropbacks this week, and Trey Burton and Jack Doyle were both at 50%. So he's kind of the odd man out. But as you look at like the season-long numbers, Mo Alley-Cox, he had a yards per target this year of 10.9, a decent amount of routes, 186 routes. He had, decent sample here, and he was really good. And I just don't know why he couldn't get more work than he did. He only had 36 targets, so not a ton of targets for that yards per target number that I cited, but actually more than Jack Doyle and almost as many as Trey Burton. And he was targeted on 19.4% of his routes. So the dude that profiles as a very interesting type of player were he to get actual chance. I don't know that he ever will, but he's the tight end here I think I'd be most interested in if some of them could go away. Jack Doyle is a cut candidate, but I'm not sure they'll exercise that. Mo Alley-Cox is a restricted free agent, so he's probably back. It's probably another gross situation here in 2021. Moving to Jacksonville, this will be interesting, right? Do they bring in a running back for 2021? Daria Gumbawale had 71% of the snaps. They did not want to give anything to Devin Azigbo here. He only had 20% of the snaps and 1.7 expected points. He got 1 carry and 1 target. Daria Gumbawale had 14 attempts for 71 yards, 5 targets for 3 receptions and 7 yards. They just leaned on Gumbawale. And so this particular staff just kind of doesn't trust anyone behind James Robinson. Gumbawale is not someone they trusted with James Robinson on the field. So they just really don't have anything. I'm guessing that a new staff does bring in some running back competition for James Robinson. And then you also have the change in staff where that you maybe have guys who aren't a one running back system the way these guys were. So Robinson, I do think, is a bit of a fragile asset. he, his value was driven by just getting all the work this year. If that changes, then things could change for him in terms of what he is as a fantasy asset. I think he's probably a sell in Dynasty and stuff. Moving to the wide receivers, DJ Shark ran a route on 76% of dropbacks, had a huge air yard share here of 53%, got 19% of the targets as well. Really nice whopper of 0.66. Wide receiver 1 level whopper there. Also had a yards per target of 8.9, which is pretty solid, especially given the quarterback situation. He had 4 for 62 and a touchdown on the day on 7 targets on 127 air yards. Keenan Cole had a route run on 87% of dropbacks, only targeted on 12% of his routes, whopper of 0.25. Laviska Shenault ran around on 87% of dropbacks. He had a 21% target per route run, used shallowly with an 8 out of 4.9, had a whopper of 0.39, kind of in the mix there, and he had a really nice touchdown catch later in the game. Went 5 for 48 and a touchdown on 7 targets. Laviska, by the way, leads the team currently in yards per route run. It's not a great number. He's at 1.49 on the season, but this has been a team that's just been awful in terms of quarterback play, and he has been the best wide receiver in terms of yards per route run. Yards per target of 7.8. He's been targeted on 19% of his routes. So I think that quietly he's put up an impressive season. It's just that we need an improvement in quarterback play, and we are now very, very likely to get one with Trevor Lawrence coming in. So Laviska, he's not going to be under the radar, especially if Pete keeps hyping him up on Twitter. But I think we get a chance here for Laviska to have a big breakout in year 2. I'll certainly be going back to the well with him. Who knows what we'll get at the tight end situation. Tyler Eifert here ran around 61% of dropbacks, targeted on 22% of his routes. James O'Shaughnessy was targeted on 25% of his routes. He ran 32% of the routes. Would be kind of interesting if we get a new tight end in here. Eifert and O'Shaughnessy, neither one of them looks very interesting as we look forward to next year. Kansas City, here we've got Darrell Williams played 70% of the snaps. Thought this might be a Le'Veon Bell situation. It was not. Williams got 6 targets. He has been the passing down back. He ran a route on 60% of his snaps. Le'Veon Bell ran a route on 55% of his snaps, so he was out there running routes a lot too. But Darrell Williams was out there more often, and he was running routes more often. So he was out there for 60% of the overall dropbacks. Le'Veon Bell just for 23%. And Darrell Williams led in attempts 10-7 over Bell. So rough day for Bell. We do have Damian Williams who will be back next year. We've got Darrell Williams probably back, restricted free agent next year. I think Le'Veon might not be, but I think for Clyde Edwards-Helaire, definitely tough if Darrell Williams is going to continue to have this passing down work, stealing some of that. And, as you look to like playoff challenges and stuff, it'll definitely be like a contrarian approach to pick CEH, but I can't stomach that. I think you got to pick one of the pass catchers or Mahomes in like the FFPC playoff challenge. At least that's the way I'm looking at it. At wide receiver, we had Tyreek Hill running around on 70% of dropbacks. We had the calf injury issue coming in. Not the calf injury, the hamstring. We had a calf injury with Sammy Watkins. He ran around 77% of dropbacks, so he missed time in this game. It doesn't look like a serious injury, but he did miss time. Mecole Hardman, as a result, got more routes than usual. He ran around 57% of dropbacks. Kind of the direct handcuff to both these guys. So he was out there more, targeted on 22% of his routes. He had a whopper of 0.31. No one really had at the wide receiver position any kind of interesting whoppers. You see them all here kind of jumbled about. Basically a weird week for Kansas City, not taking too much from it. Kelsey was his steady self, though. He had a route run on 81% of dropbacks, 31% target share, 31% air yard share, a whopper of 0.68, yards per target of 8.2. He had 7 for 98 and a touchdown on 13 targets. So he was the steady Eddie here. Moving to LA, we've got Malcolm Brown ended up getting 59% of the snaps because we had Darrell Henderson get injured. I mean, he was about to score a touchdown, right? And the guy dives, takes his ankle out, and literally took his ankle out because now he's on IR. So what could have been a touchdown turns into him not playing again for the rest of the season. Big bummer. Had that one green zone carry that was his only one. He had 12 rushing attempts for 62 yards overall. Malcolm Brown was very, very inefficient. He got 3 green zone attempts. He did not score. He had 3 targets. He only had 8 receiving yards on 1 reception. He left 9.8 points on the field. Could have been a decent day, 14.3 expected points, but was not efficient at all. We might, though, have the whole backfield to Malcolm Brown in Week 17. We'll have to see. We also now have today, it was reported Cooper Kupp's going to miss, or maybe not miss, but he's on the COVID IR. So I'm not sure if it's close contact or if he actually has COVID, but obviously keep your eye on that for Week 17. He had a route run 87% of dropbacks, 22% of the targets, 17% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.54. He had 9 targets, went 8 for 86. Decent efficiency of yards per target of 8.3. Targeted very shallowly as usual, 8 out of 5.7. Robert Woods actually led the way in routes, 96% of dropbacks for him. He had 22% of the targets, 30% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.54. He also had 2 rushing attempts, but only for 1 yard. And he had a yards per route run of just 0.96 because he was inefficient on the day. Yards per target of 5.3, 4 for 48 on 9 targets. But continues to really be, I think, the wide receiver 1 here. Kupp at least was out there a decent amount on 87% of dropbacks. Sometimes he's fallen off a bit, but he may miss entirely this week. It'll be interesting to see if Kupp misses, if that creates any additional opportunity for Van Jefferson. He only ran a route on 17% of dropbacks here, and he's had multiple attempts now to try to replace Josh Reynolds, and he has failed. So definitely interesting to see if he gets an opportunity at a full-time role if Cooper Kupp misses. Josh Reynolds, meanwhile, ran around 73% of dropbacks, and he had a whopper of 0.5. So he was pretty involved. Yards per route run of 1.71, 10 targets, which actually led the team, and 6 for 65 through the air. So he actually had a 8 out of 5.7, which was not typical of him. Typically, he's more like 10 to 12 as sort of the deep threat for this team, but he was used somewhat shallowly, and Robert Woods was actually targeted the deepest. He had an 8 out of 10. At tight end, Tyler Higbee ran around 54% of dropbacks, Gerald Everett on 60%. These guys continue to cannibalize each other. Can't really trust either of them, even though Higbee did get 6 targets in this game at least. But generally, I'm not looking to trust either of these dudes. But Gerald Everett might be gone next season. He is a free agent. So Tyler Higbee, continue to eye him for 2021. I was actually able to pick him up at a shallow dynasty league just this past week, right before Week 16. So he is available in some places, and probably someone you can get pretty cheaply in trade at the moment. Moving to the Chargers, we had Austin Eckler set up for a pretty nice day, but didn't do all that much. He got 65% of the snaps, but 11.4 expected points, not a ton. Just didn't get the huge target volume that we were hoping for. Only had 3 targets. He did get in the end zone, though. Went 3 for 23 and a touchdown on his 3 targets. And that touchdown came on a green zone target. He also had a green zone carry, but he didn't score it. He added 4.4 points in efficiency to his 11.4 workload. So solid day, but not an awesome day. Kalen Ballage took 28% of the snaps. He had 5.9 expected points, was slightly inefficient on the day. Justin Jackson also stole 14% of the snaps. And the Joshua Kelly was a healthy scratch for this game. I think he'll need a coaching change to have any chance to really rehab his value in a meaningful way. Interesting to see if Kalen Ballage is back next year. At wide receiver, we had Keenan Allen miss this game, so Jalen Guyton led the way in terms of routes. He's usually out there all the time. He was, again, running around on 92% of dropbacks. He had 15% of the targets, 13% of the air yards, and a whopper of 0.32. So hardly kind of a wide receiver one in Allen's absence, but that's basically what we expected. He was going to be, kind of doing his typical Jalen Guyton stuff out there a lot, not targeted that much. He did get 5 targets. Mike Williams soaked up a ton of the volume. He had a route run on 84% of dropbacks, 30% of the targets, 44% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.76. So he really stepped up in a big way here. He had okay yards per target of 6.8, leading to a yards per route run of 1.69. Okay is probably overstating that yards per target. Not a very good showing on a per target basis. Went 10 targets and then took that for 54 yards through the air for Mike Williams. So stepped up to get the volume, but didn't step up in terms of the production, unfortunately. Tyron Johnson, the other guy here, he ran around 74% of dropbacks. He had a whopper, though, of just 0.2, so did not get really much volume to go with his routes. Went 3 for 26 on 3 targets. So you kind of see him here, not getting targeted all that heavily, not running full slate of routes. We also had KJ Hill run just 1 route. So it really was just these 3 guys at wide receiver. Donald Parham ran a route on 71% of dropbacks, hoping for a big day for the former XFL star, but just 2 for 47 on 3 targets. Very efficient, 15.7 yards per target, but only targeted on 11% of his routes. The guy who got targeted on a ton of his routes was Steven Anderson. He had 6 targets on only 10 routes. So that was pretty impressive for Steven Anderson. He kind of had that, really high target day they were hoping for from Donald Parham with Keenan Allen out. Moving to Las Vegas, Josh Jacobs is turning in an extremely disappointing season for his owners. 50% of the snaps here, 12.7 expected points, left 5.8 points on the field. I had him in the 3-game slate. He ruined. I should have swapped to Gaskin. I thought about it, but I basically, Gaskin was the lower projected player. We weren't sure what the snap counts were going to be. I was in pretty good shape. I just kind of needed my running back to come through. I stayed on Josh Jacobs, and it really cost me in one of those Saturday spies that had Mike Evans. It was looking pretty good. It's looking pretty good. But Josh Jacobs, that's what I get. I didn't draft any of them in redraft. Tried to pick my spot and play him in DFS, and he ruined me. But yeah, I mean this sucks. Like 3 green zone carries, but didn't score anything. Only 50% of the snaps. Lost 23% of the snaps to Devontae Booker. Lost 27% of the snaps to Jalen Richard. I'm not sure this is going to change. It seems like this is the way they want to deploy their running backs. I imagine Josh Jacobs will be drafted in like the 4th to 5th round again. Not again. He was drafted in the 2nd round this year, but he'll be drafted, I imagine, no later than the 5th round. Looks to be kind of more of a 6th or 7th round value to me, but I doubt he falls that far. At wide receiver, Nelson Aguilar ran around on 76% of dropbacks. He had 20% of the targets, 37% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.56. Weighted target per route run of 2.43. Really nice efficiency, yards per target of 25.8. Had that huge catch. I mean, that's going to do it. Yards per route run of 5.54, which is obviously absurd. Targets just 6, but went 5 for 155 and a touchdown. So he's had a really nice year, Nelson Aguilar. I mean, he has a yards per route run of 2.03. He's had basically a breakout season with a new team. Pretty exciting for him. I imagine they want to bring him back. That's obviously not a good sign for Henry Ruggs. So his yards per route run of just 1.29 this year. Has yards per target of 10.4. So he has been pretty good when targeted, but only targeted on 12% of his routes this season. And, worry a little bit about the way he's being used. I don't think he's being used like particularly creatively. Not maybe the right fit for him. I would think he's kind of a developmental wide receiver. I think the very worst thing could be if he's just used as like a pure deep threat, not used in any kind of creative ways. And his ADOT on the season is at 17.8. So basically he's being used in an uncreative way. This guy's fast. he should run deep routes. And that's what we're getting. He's not delivering a ton of yards on those routes, but is just a rookie, still has some upside. Very athletic player, very fast player. Was the first wide receiver drafted in this really star-studded class, and that was consensus that he belonged in that top tier. It wasn't just the Raiders that thought that. So could see better things for Henry Ruggs, but this has been a tough rookie season. He had a yards per route, or he had an ADOT of 28 in this game. Continues to be used. Again, it's just a pure deep threat. Hunter Renfrow ran around 65% of dropbacks. He was targeted on 21% of his routes. Carr loves throwing to him, continues to love throwing to him. Darren Waller ran around 89% of his 89% of dropbacks. He had 20% of the targets, 32% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.53. Kind of like a lower than normal day in terms of the underlying volume for Waller, but still a very nice day for a tight end. He delivered with 18.7 yards per target, 5 for 112 yards on 6 targets. Didn't get in the end zone, but still a very nice week 16 for Darren Waller. He's going to be, drafted like an elite tight end because he is an elite tight end. I think we can trust Darren Waller going forward into next season as an elite tight end. He kind of fits everything we're looking for. And now we've got 2 seasons of him doing it. We know that he is a special tight end. Moving to Miami, Myles Gaskin came back with 76% of the snaps, 15.4 expected points, delivered 18.5 points over expected, just absolutely crushed. He had a green zone target that he scored on and another green zone carry that he did not score on, but he did have 2 receiving touchdowns, went 5 for 82, and those 2 touchdowns on 5 targets, went 87 yards on the ground on 14 carries. Just an awesome day for Myles Gaskin. It was turned in a terrific year, considering that he came out of nowhere. Salvin Ahmed, he had only 24% of the snaps and only 4.1 expected points. He was inefficient on the day. Does look like Miami's going to be a one-back system, and this is something that we can, I think, trust going forward into next year, where they have shown us that they really trust Myles Gaskin to be the guy. We're not going to get a coaching change here. We're not going to get any kind of major changes, really, I think, to the offense. So I would expect that we get Myles Gaskin kind of locked into a role. He is someone that, I don't know if he'll get 75% of the snaps next year, but I would say he's looking like between 60 and 70% of the snaps. And maybe, he's got upside to kind of be at that 75% plus, even if they add a little bit of competition. So I'm pretty excited about Gaskin as we move forward. I wonder where his ADP ends up settling. I doubt that it ends up being extremely exuberant, but I have a tendency to underestimate where the market will draft running backs. At wide receiver, we had Jakeem Grant go down with a high ankle sprain in this game, so he only ran around on 40% of dropbacks. Lynn Bowden led the way with 93%, but he was only targeted on 5% of his routes. I've talked up Lynn Bowden ad nauseum in this show. He's disappointed now a couple of weeks in a row, but still I think he's somewhat interesting long term. I do think that the fact that he was able to get on the field as a wide receiver despite getting drafted as a running back by a different team and then cut, it's nice to see him reemerge. But could have been a bigger day for him here in the revenge game. Mac Hollins ran around 73% of dropbacks. He had an 8 out of 14, only targeted on 14% of his routes. Kind of a field stretcher, deep threat, really. Isaiah Ford was in for 65% of dropbacks. Not the strongest day for him with a whopper of 0.36, but he was involved a decent amount. And then Mike Gesicki ran around 73% of dropbacks. He had a target per route run of 24%. And he had a yards per target of 7.7, which was solid, leading to a yards per route run of 1.86. Mike Gesicki has improved this year in terms of his target per route run. He has a nice ADOT. He's used deeper downfield than the typical tight end here at an ADOT of 10.9. And that's kind of right where he normally is. He's at an 11.2 ADOT this year. So I think Mike Gesicki will profile as someone that I'm somewhat interested in next year. I've dogged him a lot this year. I'm probably going to be on board next year as long as he's not too expensive. But yeah, we'll have to see. It'd be kind of fun to get on the bandwagon for Mike Gesicki since all my buddies were super on with Gesicki this year, and I just couldn't get on board with the grown-ass man. Moving to Minnesota, we had Dalvin Cook at 58% of the snaps. Game script kind of going against him a bit here. He had 12.7 expected points. He did add efficiency, 3.8 points of efficiency on top of that, despite not getting in the end zone on his only green zone carry. He did, though, lose a green zone carry and touchdown to Mike Boone, which is pretty disappointing. And then he lost some snaps here to Amir Abdullah, who had 17% of the snaps. And we also had Jake Bartigas playing 11% of the snaps. So not getting the full snap count with game script kind of getting away from them. And I also wonder if maybe this team is starting to look ahead to 2021. They now have him under contract. They may want to save Cook in this season. That's not gonna turn into anything for the Vikings. Moving to wide receiver, Justin Jefferson had a really nice day in the underlying volume, running around 95% of dropbacks. He had 26% of the targets, 38% of the air yards, whopper of 0.66. Not the most efficient day on a per target basis for Jefferson, at least compared to what we've seen at some points throughout the season. 8.5 yards per target, yard per route run of 2.07, which is pretty damn good. I guess we're kind of grading on a Justin Jefferson scale at this point, and that's actually below where he's been on the year, even though a 2+ yards per route run for a rookie is very, very bullish. He had 10 targets, went 6 for 85 on those 10 targets. Adam Thielen had the better day from a yards per route run perspective. He had a 2.62 yards per route run, but he had lower underlying volume that was driven by him being more efficient on a per target basis. Thielen had a route run on 86% of dropbacks. He had 24% of the targets, 28% of the air yards, a whopper 0.55. He went 8 for 97 and a touchdown on 9 targets, really delivering with the 12.1 yards per target. It's really just these two guys. Chad Beebe ran around on 44% of dropbacks, was not targeted. Olabisi Johnson on 16%, was targeted once. So, maybe the most condensed wide receiver room in the league. Irv Smith and Tyler Conklin, though, were both involved as wide receivers or as receivers at the tight end position. Irv Smith got a route run on 89% of dropbacks. He had 24% of the targets, 30% of the air yards. He had 9 targets for 6 receptions, 53 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Yards per route run of 1.43. Not overly impressive, but hey, he got in the end zone twice. That's pretty nice. Tyler Conklin ran a route on 74% of dropbacks. He had 16% of targets, 0% of the air yards with an 8 out of 0, and a whopper of 0.24. He basically continues to show that this is a 2 tight end system. I do think that Irv Smith, if there's any excitement about the way he's closing the season and that drives his redraft ADP, he looks like the guy that I'm probably, fading, going into the headwind and fading him, because I just don't trust him to be able to earn targets with Thielen there, with Justin Jefferson there, and with Kyle Rudolph still there. So I'm not really interested in Irv Smith next year beyond kind of where he was going in drafts this year. Like if his ADP doesn't change much from where it was this year, sure, but I imagine that it will. Moving to running back, we've got Sony Michel leading the way with 38% of snaps, and then James White and J.J. Taylor are both at 32%. The leader here was James White with 6.5 expected points. This whole backfield is just disgusting. We need a different quarterback in 2021 before we start using any of these running backs. I mean, Damian Harris at times was a little bit usable, but it's gross. It's gross right now without him, and I think it's going to be gross again next year if we have Cam Newton here again. Jacoby Myers ran around on 100% of dropbacks. He had a target share of 33%, 30% of the air yards, a really nice whopper of 0.71. He was not efficient, not really. Yards per target of 7.5, yards per out run of 1.73, which isn't terrible. But this is by far the best among the wide receivers and tight ends. So in that regard, pretty solid day for Jacoby Myers. And just eating up volume here. Eating up volume for New England, you see here on the chart. Really the only guy that you'd be interested in terms of the underlying volume. The only other guy that you would maybe be interested in is N'Keal Harry, who ran around 77% of dropbacks, and he had a whopper of 0.58, which is actually pretty solid, but only had one reception for 3 yards. The nice thing for N'Keal Harry is that at least his ADOT was pretty high. He had a 15.2 ADOT. If there's a new quarterback, just because Cam's struggled so much that it's hard for me to imagine, Harry breaking out in 2021 with Cam. I guess it could happen, but I'm not that optimistic. But, maybe they get a new quarterback and they keep Harry in this deep threat role. That I think could be nice. I've talked about this before, but he was being used on all these shallow routes and even on like handoffs and stuff. And it seems like now he's being recast as a bit more of a deep threat. I think that's probably better, although his 0.8 yards per target would beg to differ in this game. Damiere Byrd was out there for 100% of dropbacks, but not very good on them. Yards per target of 2.3. Have to imagine they're looking at other options at wide receiver. Although, Damiere Byrd had an 8.5 yards per target this year. N'Keal Harry was at 5.5. He might be the guy that would suffer first if they do bring in new wide receiver competition. At tight end, I would mention that Devin Ossie ran a bunch of routes, ran 77% of routes. He hasn't been involved really at all this year, so that's mildly interesting. I guess like deep stuff where you can stash him in tight end premium dynasty for, he's not going to do anything next year probably, so you can stash him away. But I would also guess they're, a pretty solid candidate to bring in a tight end. Moving to New Orleans, another one of these massive days in Week 16. 6 touchdowns for Alvin Kamara. He had 22 attempts, 155 yards, and 6 rushing touchdowns. I mean, if you told me that Alvin Kamara was going to have 6 touchdowns, I would have guessed that at least 3 of them were through the air. None of them were. That was the kind of most surprising day about this massive fantasy performance. He had 27.2 expected points. He delivered 29 points in efficiency, right? Like when I say elite workloads, typically that's like over 20 expected points. So to be able to deliver 29 points over expected, just absurd. There's only a few players in all of football that can have that kind of fantasy points over expected type of day. Your Dalvin Cooks, your Alvin Kamara's, Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey when healthy. It's a very limited list, the type of dudes who can put up those numbers. That's why, as much as I do like to hammer wide receiver in my drafts, you do make exceptions for the guys who can win you leagues with that level of efficiency on top of an elite workload like we saw here. 27.2 expected points, 29 points over expectation. Wow. Latavius Murray, by the way, got 39% of the snaps. So he was, it's a 60-40 split here at running back. So it didn't even come down to Kamara dominating the snaps, but this is the formula with Kamara. We expect the high value work, and we got that. We got the huge high value work on a limited snap count, which in some ways is the very best combination because you don't worry as much about injury when that happens. At wide receiver, we got, no Mike Thomas. So Marquez Callaway actually led the way with a route run on 68% of dropbacks. He had a whopper of 0.37. Emmanuel Sanders had a route run on 64% of dropbacks, a whopper of 0.44. That led all New Orleans players. He had really nice efficiency, actually, Emmanuel Sanders, 16.6 yards per target, but did not score, so 4 for 83 on 5 targets. And then we had a bunch of kind of jumbled names after that. Juwan Johnson, 18% routes. Austin Carr, 11%. Lil Jordan Humphrey down at 7%. And then Jared Cook and Adam Troutman both ran a route on 71% dropback. So they were in 2 tight end in this game. Taysom Hill also ran around on 29% of dropbacks trying to get his tight end eligibility back in DFS. But Jared Cook keeping the targets to himself at tight end. He had 20% target per route run, just 10% for Adam Troutman, just 13% for Taysom Hill. So Jared Cook really the only real interesting name here right now. And then Adam Troutman, as we look at his breakout profile for 2021, also looking pretty weak. I don't think we're going to have much of a second-year breakout class at the tight end position in 2021, which would make sense because this was uniformly regarded as a weak tight end class. Moving to the Giants, we have Wayne Gallman here had a route or had 50% of the snaps. Deion Lewis at 38%, Alfred Morris at 12%, but Wayne Gallman led the way with an expected point workload of just 5.1. Not trusting anyone here. Hopefully we get Saquon back next season, right at week 1, fully healthy. That would be ideal. Sterling Shepard ran a route here on 100% of dropbacks. He had 29% of the targets, 21% of the air yards, whopper of 0.59. I always kind of want it to be Darius Slayton is clearly the wide receiver 1 here, but looking over the course of the season, you do have to say that it's at least a wide receiver 1A, 1B situation. Slayton does have the higher whopper of 0.53. Shepard has a 0.49. Weighted target per route run, though, tilts towards Shepard, who struggled some with injuries. He's at 1.83 to Slayton's 1.67. So we got a lot more routes from Slayton this year. There's a lot more involved, but when he was out there, I think Sterling Shepard was basically the 1A to Slayton's 1B. Slayton's dynasty prospects, I think, took a big hit this season. Not totally dead, but just hard to get too excited about him moving forward. He had route run on 92% of dropbacks in this game, 20% of targets, 28% of air yards, a whopper of 0.49. He went 2 for 26 on 8 targets with really poor yards per target efficiency, 3.3. And then Evan Ingram here, he ran a route on 79% of dropbacks, 26% target per route run was pretty nice, and a yards per route run of 1.71 because his yards per target was not all that great at 6.5. He had 10 targets, though, and went 7 for 65. Golden Tate had a calf injury in this game, so he didn't play. He had a calf injury in practice and missed the game. And so we had Austin Mack out there a decent amount, Dante Pettis out there a decent amount, CJ Board out there for 10% of routes. So I think Evan Ingram's prospects might improve somewhat if we don't have Golden Tate in 2021, and he's sort of slotting in more as the wide receiver 3 most weeks, as is not all that interested in Evan Ingram next season, and he's likely or at least possible to miss week 17. So we might be done with Evan Ingram for this season at least. Moving to the Jets, looks like we will not have Frank Gore for week 17. He'll miss week 17. So I think we'll get LaMichael Pirine as the lead back here. He had 28% of the snaps and 7.6 expected points. He got 9 carries to Ty Johnson's 2. He got 2 targets to 0 for Ty Johnson. So LaMichael Pirine, as gross as it is, may be in the mix here for week 17 purposes. I imagine they'll bring someone in, but Pirine may get a chance to be the starter. Obviously, completely depends on what the new coaching staff does. Brashad Perriman ran around on 100% of dropbacks. Denzel Mims ran around on 92% of dropbacks. They combined for 0 receptions. Really gross stuff. I mean, really putting, the prayer yards, really emphasizing the prayer yards here, because Brashad Perriman had 107 air yards and 6 targets, came down with 0 receptions, 37 air yards and 2 targets for Denzel Mims. Also goose-egged. Jamison Crowder, though, who is the guy who's been peppered more with targets from Sam Darnold throughout the course of the season and was on Josh Hermsmeyer's buy low model this past week, he did deliver. He had a route run on 97% of dropbacks, 32% of the air yards, 32% of the targets, 21% of the air yards, whopper of 0.63. He had nice yards per target of 10.2, went 7 for 92 and a touchdown on 9 targets. And then, as we know, tight end is just an absolute dumpster fire here. Chris Herndon was out there for 79% of dropbacks, which is like an elite mark for a tight end, but only targeted on 13% of his routes, had a whopper of 0.28. He did get in the end zone, but it's just really, really gross here. And I think even on our new coaching staff, not going to be very interested in Chris Herndon. He'll have to come very, very cheap before I'll kick the tires on that. In Philly, we did have another Jordan Howard sighting this week, which was, that's always a little scary when you have Miles Sanders going or you're playing him in DFS. But luckily, Jordan Howard, while he did get 10% of the snaps, that came at the expense of Boston Scott, who was at 11%. That's down from where he's been. And Miles Sanders was staying right around the 80% mark at 78% this week. So I'm not sure what was going on where Miles Sanders was dipping way, way below 80% of snaps. But now at the close of the season, we're starting to see Miles Sanders look like the workhorse we thought he was going to be. He is someone that I think is probably going to be pretty interesting, in that I would imagine kind of late first, early second round range. He is going to be the guy who's tempting to take a stab on as a potential elite running back with Jalen Hurts, potentially with some efficiency in the run game. And hey, he got 6 targets in this game. So the typical thing of, the Russian quarterback is going to hurt the target profile of the running back. Maybe not as much in this case for whatever reason. 3 green zone carries here, got in the end zone, went 15 for 61 and a touchdown on the ground, 6 for 4 and 27 yards through the air. I think, it's a little tough with Miles Sanders, but like I said, do feel pretty good about him moving forward. Moving to wide receiver, this I do not feel good about. Greg Ward ran a route on 92% of dropbacks, continues to kind of be like the clear-cut guy they have to have on the field. They got to get Greg Ward on the field for some reason. Don't know why. He had a yards per route run here of 0.61. He has a yards per route run on the season of 0.88. A competent coaching staff would not have Greg Ward as their number 1 wide receiver. He has a yards per target on the season of 5.5. What we have after Greg Ward is this jumble of wide receivers, which became even more jumbled with the return of Deshaun Jackson. Jalen Reagor led the way in the jumble with a route run of 48% of dropbacks. Travis Fulgham was at 42%. Alshon Jeffrey was at 40%. Deshaun Jackson was at 33%. Quez Watkins was at 21%. Until they get a new wide receivers coach, I don't think we can trust any of these guys. I assume Aaron Moorhead, the wide receivers coach, is behind this rotation because I watched an interview where he was talking about how much he liked this rotation. He was keeping fresh legs for the fourth quarter, which, of course, Jalen Hurts' numbers are terrible in the second half. He's awesome in the first half and terrible in the second half. So whatever theory he has about, keeping fresh legs for the fourth quarter does not appear to be paying off. And, in a position like wide receiver that depends on chemistry with the quarterback, it seems kind of insane to me to have your outside wide receivers not on the field, any of them, for at least 50% of snaps. But what do I know? I'm just a dude who looks at the numbers. So, God, it's so frustrating. But, Jalen Reagor, as you guys know, was someone that I targeted heavily in all formats this past season. I'm not giving up on him in Dynasty, but certainly for redraft next year, I'm going to need some kind of coaching change, some kind of, ideally we have less bodies. Ideally we have Alshon Jeffrey move on. We may have Deshaun Jackson move on. That would help. But I think some kind of fundamental shift in the philosophy that, by the way, only the Eagles employ this philosophy. No one else in the entire NFL seems to think this is a good idea, but you need to have some sort of shift in that philosophy and get some full-time outside wide receivers before you can really trust drafting these guys. It's that simple. They're just not out there enough. Alex Goddard, he had a calf injury in this game, ran a route on only 29% of dropbacks, did get 3 targets on 14 routes, target per route run of 21% before leaving, but Zach Ertz was able to be out there a lot with Dallas Goedert out. He had 79% route run per dropback. He had 7 targets, but he had a yards per target of 5.5 and yards per route run of 0.87. I do think that Zach Ertz is washed, and it sounds like he's going to be done in Philly after this year. Moving to the Steelers, Got James Conner. He had 62% of the snaps. He had a decent day. He had 12 expected points, 5.5 points added in efficiency. That was pretty nice. He scored his only green zone carry, 5 for 20 and a touchdown on the ground, 5 for 5 and 45 yards through the air. Benny Snell had 32% of the snaps, and then Jalen Samuels was in for just 6. It does seem that Benny Snell has at least a chance to take over as kind of the 2-down guy next season, assuming James Conner is not brought back, but certainly hasn't crushed the audition that he's gotten. He left 7 points on the field this week on a workload of 7 points. So Benny Snell had 6 attempts for 0 yards, and he was not targeted. So Benny Snell has not been impressive. I do think the coaching staff seems to like him more than the other options, but I think they'll probably add some other options. My guess is they'll probably let James Conner go and maybe draft somebody that would seem to be kind of the Steelers' move. Moving to wide receiver, got Deontay Johnson here. Let's start with Juju Smith-Schuster, actually, because he ran the most routes, as is typically the case, ran around 98% of dropbacks. He had 27% of the targets, 26% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.58, pretty solid underlying volume, and he was decent on the day in terms of his yards per target with an 8 yards per target, 1.96 yards per route run, got in the end zone, 9 for 96 on 13 targets. This is kind of like we were expecting a lot more days like this from Juju. Decent underlying volume. You see him here, maybe not the most air yards in the world with an 8 out of 6.8, but hey, a lot of targets, 13 targets, getting in the end zone, running all the routes. This was the Juju profile. Like when we were taking Juju in drafts, this is what we were expecting. There haven't been many days like this, and I do think Juju is also probably out the door next season. Hopefully he lands with somewhere with decent quarterback play. Don't want to see him in an Allen Robinson type of situation. Chase Claypool, though, he's someone we got to talk about because he ran more routes than Deontay Johnson. Ran a route on 86% of dropbacks. He had a low target per route run of 14%, wasn't targeted heavily, yard per route run of 1.26. So that was disappointing. But the thing with Chase Claypool is that, in week 15, he ran around on 69% of dropbacks. In week 14, he was at 58%. In week 13, he was down at 43%. Now, he was falling way off in terms of his routes. He was at 71% in week 12. He has previously, he'd been up there at decent ranges, but it had fallen way off. And, as a result, starting to get skeptical that we can really trust him. The fact that now he's back up above Deontay Johnson is a really good sign looking forward. Obviously, for week 17 purposes, they're resting people, so you can't count on anybody there. But looking forward to 2021, it's a really nice sign, especially with Juju likely gone, and looking to the playoffs in terms of like the playoff challenge stuff. I think he is in the mix. It was looking like probably needed to play Deontay Johnson as like the only Steeler who made any sense to pick. Now you can pick Claypool, I think, as an upside candidate, and hope that we only have the one week after a many week stretch of lower than ideal routes, but the dude can play. I mean, on the season, he's at a yards per route run of 1.88. That's fallen off a lot from where it was. At one point he was well over 2. But he's an athletic guy. He was at some points getting carries around the goal line. So he is someone that I think for these playoff challenges is pretty interesting and gives us an option to swap off of Deontay Johnson. Eric Ebron here ran a route on 76% of dropbacks. He had a whopper of 0.3, targeted on 18% of his routes. He got 7 targets. He went 5 for 47 with a touchdown. I think he's definitely kind of in that above the dart throw level. He's not like an awesome tight end play, but he's also someone for FFPC with the tight end premium. You could maybe get a little cute and play Eric Ebron at tight end. Moving to Seattle, we have Chris Carson with 63% of the snaps, Carlos Hyde with 32%. Chris Carson had 11.8 expected points, and Carlos Hyde had just 2. So no doubt about who the lead ball carrier was here. Chris Carson had 16 Rushing attempts for 69 yards, very nice. And Carlos Hyde was at 2 for 8. So, again, no doubt about the clear lead back. What was interesting is that Carlos Hyde ran a route on 80% of his snaps. That was a little surprising. I'm not exactly sure why they're using Carlos Hyde as the passing down back. He ran around a 41% of dropbacks. Carson was at 54%, but Carson was out there so much more. So, yeah, Carlos Hyde this week was used as kind of a passing down specialist for whatever reason. Bit strange, but not too much more to say about that since Carson racked up all the expected points. At wide receiver, DK Metcalf ran a route on 97% of dropbacks. He had 28% of the targets, 28% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.61, yards per target of 7.4, and a yards per route run of 1.55. Went 6 for 59 on 8 targets. So not the best day for DK Metcalf. Was out there a lot, got a decent amount of volume, didn't crush in terms of yards per target. And his volume was good, not great. Tyler Lockett kind of coexisted in a way with DK Metcalf, although neither one had an awesome game, but both had solid volume. You see Tyler Lockett up here getting decent amount of the air yards, running a lot of routes. He ran a route on 97% of dropbacks as well. 17% of the targets, 31% of the air yards. He had an 8 out of 19.6 to Lockett's to Metcalf's 11.2. So that's the discrepancy in air yards despite the lower target total. Whopper of 0.47 to Metcalf's 0.61. And he had a yards per route run of 1.66. Targeted less, but better yards per target efficiency. Went 3 for 44 on 5 targets. Would like to see this offense get back to cooking. It's been a shame that we have not had the breakout blow-up performances from these wide receivers like we were getting early in the year. We had a route run by DJ Moore and Freddie Swain. Both were at 44%. Penny Hart was at 3%. And then Jacob Hollister and Will Dissly were both at 33%. Greg Olsen getting in the mix at 28%. This is now a 3-way tight end committee. Can't trust anyone here. Moving to San Francisco, Jeff Wilson had a really nice game. I was excited about Jeff Wilson entering this game. I thought he had really nice upside because he was, not just this goal line back. They'd shown by using him running routes that I did think he would have a chance to get, kind of a workhorse level role. He did in terms of the snaps. He got 70% of the snaps. He actually did not have quite as many expected points as you might think, given the box score result. He only had 13.9 expected points, but he's very efficient on the day with 13.5 points added. In efficiency, he went 22 for 183 on the ground, and then he turned 2 targets into 1 for 21 and a touchdown. Did not get any green zone carries in this game. Did not get any green zone targets, which is why his expected points were not ideal. But, he did score from 21 yards out. I imagine he would have gotten, let's say he gets stuffed at the 1. He could have gotten 3 straight green zone carries, and all of a sudden his workload looks off the charts. So I do think that the 70% of the snaps tell a pretty nice story here for Jeff Wilson. With Raheem Mostert out, they are willing to lean on him. Jerick McKinnon only got 18% of the snaps, Tevin Coleman at 12%. At wide receiver, we are not going to see Brandon Ayuk again this year. He will miss week 17 with an ankle injury. Disappointing close to the season. Was looking really, really strong and kind of had a couple letdowns to close the season. He ran around on 92% of dropbacks here, but had just 10% of the targets, 18% of the area. It's a whopper of 0.27, yards per route run of 0.65. Really weak performance for Brandon Ayuk. But on the season, he has a yards per route run of 1.73, yards per target of 8. Was targeted on 21.5% of his routes. He had a whopper on the season of 0.56. Very strong numbers for a rookie wide receiver. And he is in the offense that, in an offense that we're excited about for developing young players. So even with Deebo Samuel's back and healthy next year, even with George Kittle back and healthy next year, so the volume might be a little bit more inconsistent for Brandon Ayuk week to week. I'm very excited about Brandon Ayuk in 2021. Very excited. I think, weapons are a good thing for an offense, and they could be scoring a lot of points in 2021. once Ayuk and Samuel and Kittle are all healthy, and we get a healthy Garoppolo, or hell, even a healthy Nick Mullins. I think the offense was doing just fine with him. The other wide receivers here, Kendrick Bourne ran around on 48% of dropbacks. I don't see an injury with him, and Richie James was out on 92% of dropbacks. So, you're kind of the deep names that you're keeping in mind if there's injuries next season may change from Bourne to James. We'll have to see. Unless there's an injury I was missing there. George Kittle had a bigger role than expected, running a route on 60% of dropbacks. He was targeted on 33% of his routes, though. On the chart here, I often say, this is a part of the graph where we're looking for guys who, if they run more routes, they could be breakout players. Well, at this point, it's more about guys returning from injury, right? And most of the breakout players have announced themselves. Kittle here looking like just an absolute star on a per route basis. When he gets back to run a full slate of routes, the dude's going to crush. He had a yards per route run of 6.13. He had 5 for 4 receptions and 92 yards on just 15 routes. So really exciting stuff to see George Kittle back out there. Hopefully he continues to trend in the right direction and then crushes next season. I do think, maybe he'll be a little bit of a value next season in drafts because he had so many injuries this year, but he is a true star at the tight end position. Moving to Tampa Bay, this was a blowout. So Leonard Fournette's 32% of snaps really understates probably what he would have gotten had the game not gotten out of hand. He did get 9.8 expected points. He did score on a green zone carry. He went 9 for 34 and a touchdown on the ground, 3 for 3 receptions at 32 yards through the air. So, you may be a little bit disappointed if you played Leonard Fournette. I had this whole theory of biased rationality, which was that, because I'm too biased to ever play Leonard Fournette, I was going to jump on the Brady passing game. This worked to perfection. Unfortunately, I played Josh Jacobs in this lineup and ruined the day. But I talked enough about that already. Keyshawn Vaughn got an audition in this game, 45% of the snaps. He got 9.9 expected points. He left 2 points on the field in terms of efficiency. He went 15 for 62 on the ground. He turned 2 targets into 1 reception for 7 yards. He didn't look that bad from, what I saw, but did not play efficiently overall. LaShawn McCoy got 17% of the snaps, 0.9 expected points. So really they kind of turned it over to Vaughn just to see what they had there, which makes sense in that type of game as we get to the end of the season. It sounds like Ronald Jones will be back for week 17. I may or may not push for him as a selection in our playoff challenge. I don't know. We'll have to see how I feel. Moving to the wide receivers here, Mike Evans had a route run on 87% of dropbacks. He had 29% of the targets, 40% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.72. And then really nice day in yards per target of 15.1, leading to yards per route run of 4.64, which is obviously off the charts. 10 receptions for 182 yards and 2 touchdowns. I do have a team where I had Alvin Kamara, Mike Evans, Devontae Adams, and Stephon Diggs on the same team. This is an FFPC best ball team. So that was pretty nice. I came back from 60 points down to win the league. So Mike Evans, tip of the hat, awesome stuff. He is an elite wide receiver, and I think Tom Brady has been, bad for Mike Evans. I think that's pretty clear. He's tended to spread the ball out a bit and has really put in jeopardy Evans' streak of getting to 1,000 yards every season. But Mike Evans is now at 960 receiving yards, so he just needs 40 yards in week 17. It sounds like the Bucs will be playing their starters. They're playing for a better seed. So hopefully we get Mike Evans to 1,000 yards this week. Hopefully Tom Brady doesn't ruin Mike Evans' streak. It'd be pretty bad. Kind of like, the quarterback play might be a problem here. I don't know. I've dogged Tom Brady some this year. He's obviously coming off a massive game, so not the best spot for me to try to do that. But Mike Evans, awesome game. Glad to see it. Chris Godwin ran a route on 67% of dropbacks. He had 22% of the targets, 31% of the air yards, whopper of 0.55, yards per route run of 2.8, which is really good, just not quite as good as what Evans did. He went 5 for 84 and a touchdown on 9 targets. Nice to see that from him. Antonio Brown only ran around 64% of dropbacks, but was targeted fairly heavily as usual, 21% target per route run, targeted shallowly, 8 out of 4.5. Mike Evans was at 15.4, Chris Godwin at 16. So these guys were targeted as deep threats this week. The guys underneath were Antonio Brown at 4.5 and then Scotty Miller at 8, and Tyler Johnson was at -1. So they were the underneath guys. Antonio Brown had a whopper of 0.26. So not too heavily involved. You see him in the chart here. Not all that ideal. But he did get in the end zone, 4 for 35 and a touchdown on 6 targets. At tight end, Rob Gronkowski, only ran around on 36% of dropbacks, in large part, I think, due to the script. 8 out of 24. He does get used sometimes as a deep threat, and he got in the end zone twice as a result. 2 for 58 on and 2 touchdowns on only 2 targets. So very, very efficient day, obviously, for Rob Gronkowski. Yards per target of 29. But yeah, some of that's obviously just ridiculously efficient, but also he didn't get as many opportunities as he typically would in a normal game. Moving to Tennessee, this was a rough game for Tennessee overall. They had Devontae Adams smashing them, and they just couldn't get going on offense in the snow. The run game didn't look like its usual self. Maybe D. Hember, I don't know. It's like if you can't handle the snow, can you really have the month of December named after you? This was a rough outing for the man who's claimed December. Derrick Henry did get 71% of the snaps. He got 10.6 expected points, which is not very good. It's kind of a committee level workload, but there weren't a ton of expected points that he was losing. He lost 3.1 to Darrington Evans, 2.1 to Jeremy McNichols. Yeah, it would have been better if he got, like 15, 16 expected points. But there was not an elite workload to be had in this backfield. They just couldn't get enough going on the ground. Henry left 0.8 points on the field. The other running backs left 2.8 and 0.5 points on the field. So no one was efficient on the day, and no one had a strong workload. Henry had 23 attempts, but none of those attempts were in the green zone, right? So it's all kind of like, those low value carries. What Ben Gretch's trap stat really kind of captures is those trivial rush attempts, right? The carries that are outside of the 10-yard line. And we want guys who are getting carries near the goal line and who are getting targeted. Derrick Henry was not targeted, and he didn't get any carries near the goal line. But as we know, that's a function of what this offense was doing, not because they're going to give the goal line carries to someone else. So it's just a weak setup for Derrick Henry to some extent, although he is sort of the engine of their offense to some degree. So, he bears some of the blame for that, I suppose. Let's see. At wide receiver, A.J. Brown ran around on 83% of dropbacks. He had 32% of the targets, 39% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.75. He had yards per route run of 1.72 because he didn't pair that with good efficiency. He had a yards per target of just 6.1. And so he went 4 for 43 on 8 targets. The yards per target of 6.1 was better, at least, than Corey Davis's, who had 0. He ran around on 80% of dropbacks. He had a whopper of 0.19, targeted just twice on his 24 dropbacks, but he did not haul on either target. So really rough day for him. Then we have Cameron Batson, ran around 60% of dropbacks, targeted though on just 6% of his routes. Nick Westbrook ran around 20% of dropbacks. Khalif Raymond was at 13%. So kind of nothing too much going on. Only one target for each of these guys behind Corey Davis. Jonnu Smith ran around on 70% of dropbacks. He had 7 targets, 3 receptions for 30 yards and a touchdown for Jonnu Smith. A nice lead over Anthony Ferkser, at least, who only ran around on 23% of dropbacks. So that was nice to see for Jonnu, but I do think that Jonnu has maybe kind of missed an opportunity here overall as I zoom out. He is a free agent after the year. He had a yards per route run this year of 1.6. I'm not sure what they think, about him as kind of someone to re-sign and make their long-term tight end. Didn't fall flat on his face, but definitely a bit of a missed opportunity for Jonnu. Not someone that I'm willing to chase up if his ADP increases from where it was this season. Finally, with Washington, we had the script go the wrong way for Antonio Gibson. Seemed like he was healthy coming back off his toe injury, but only got 30% of the snaps. Did get 10 expected points, got 10 carries for 61 yards. He got 4 targets. He went 3 for 8. But, this was not the right script for him. I'm not sure if it's going to be the right script again this week. We'll have to see how much the Eagles push them. But if it does end up being a negative script, then J.D. McKissic is going to eat again. He got 69% of the snaps and 19.3 expected points. He performed efficiently. He's not typically performed efficiently this year. But hey, I just talked about how David Montgomery, we got a little bit caught up with just assuming that a guy is bad and will perform efficiently when he has big workloads and big share of the snaps. J.D. McKissic's workload is much more dependent on a certain type of game script. It's not going to be locked in. But, Washington's bad. So that game script comes up fairly often, and I think it could come up again. He got 10 targets this week. He went 8 for 77 and a touchdown through the air. I mean, dude's like a wide receiver, but he also plays running back, added 415 on the ground. So, J.D. McKissic could be kind of interesting in week 17. We'll have to see. I wonder if, Terry McLaurin missing contributed somewhat to that. It definitely contributed to us seeing Antonio Gandy Golden for really the first time this year in any meaningful way. Ran a route on 89% of dropbacks. He had 19% of the targets, he had 6% of the targets, 10% of the air yards. I was reading off Cam Sims' line for just a second. So not super involved, targeted on 6% of his routes, yards per target of 0, did not haul in any of his 3 targets. So Antonio Gandy Golden did not make an impression, but he had he had an 8 out of 16.7. He was kind of interesting as a prospect. If he was dropped anywhere, or if you still have waivers open on some shallow leagues, I do think he's worth an ad if you got the spot. He's worth an ad going into 2021. Hopefully we'll get a new quarterback in here. Terry McLaurin is good, but there is nothing behind him. So if Antonio Gandy Golden could do anything in the offseason and become an outside wide receiver in this offense, could be kind of interesting. Right now, that other outside wide receiver is Cam Sims. He ran around 100% of dropbacks, had 19% of the targets, 34% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.53. So decent underlying numbers in terms of the volume, and also at a yards per target of 7.9, which is solid. He had a weighted targets per route run of 1.77, yards per route run of 1.19, which is not so great. He turned 9 targets into 3 for 63. So, Cam Sims, not all that great, but he does have a 10.6 yards per target on the season. So when targeted, he's been good, but he just doesn't earn targets very well. He only targeted on 11.5% of his routes, only targeted his weighted target per route run of 1.06. So there's certainly an opportunity for a guy like Antonio Gandy Golden to take over an outside wide receiver spot. And what was interesting is that Steven Sims just kind of continued to do his thing in the slot, even with Terry McLaurin missing. He ran around on 70% of dropbacks, did not see a role change. So, there's a very clear-cut way they're going to use Steven Sims, which also then creates an opportunity for Gandy Golden. Logan Thomas ran a route here on 100% of dropbacks, which shouldn't have been a surprise, really, with Terry McLaurin out, but it always is a bit of a surprise to see a tight end at 100% of dropbacks. I mean, these guys often will block sometimes on passing routes, and Logan Thomas is essentially truly a wide receiver at this point. So he got 12 targets, He went 7 for 63. He got a whopper of 0.53, which tied with Cam Sims for the lead on the team. He had a weighted target per route run of 1.85, which was the highest on the team other than Antonio Gibson. Yards per route run of 1.19, though, which isn't very good. And the yards per target of 5.3, which is not good. I do wonder if Logan Thomas is going to end up being popular at all as a tight end and FFPC and stuff. If he is, I do not think that I will be in. I mean, he is tight end 6 on Whopper this season, so he has gotten some decent work, and he just runs a ton of routes, but there's a lot of downside here for him to run less routes. There's no upside for his role to increase. He does not pop in targets per route run, only 17.5% there. If his routes decrease, then I think it's really, I don't think he's going to make up for it necessarily with higher target per route run. He didn't really show that much in terms of an ability to earn targets. He just basically took advantage of a lack of playmakers. If there are more playmakers, I think Logan Thomas could turn back into a pumpkin here. So not someone that I'm looking to chase right now. Well, certainly he's definitely in play right now, but not someone I'm looking to chase after week 17 of this year. Good luck in week 17 if you're playing DFS. Good luck in the playoffs. I may end up doing this next week too. We'll see. Yeah, it's been a fun season, guys. Thank you for watching. Really do appreciate it. Really do hope you guys had an awesome season. Check us out on Wednesday. We'll be back Wednesday. Ben and I are going to be doing Chasing Signals again on Friday. And please subscribe to the channel. We're getting really, really close to the 1,000 subscriber mark that we've been trying to hit. So that would mean a lot if you're able to subscribe. Happy holidays, and we will see you on Wednesday.